My name is Emily Carter. I'm 42 years old, and for the last 16 years, I had unlocked the front doors of Ashcroft Manufacturing almost every weekday before the sun had fully risen over Chicago. If someone had asked me back then who I was, I probably wouldn't have started with my age or where I lived. I would have said I worked in finance, not because it was just a job, because it had quietly become my identity. Numbers had always made sense to me in ways people sometimes didn't. A spreadsheet never lied to make itself look better. A balance sheet didn't care about office politics. If something was wrong, there was always a reason. You just had to be patient enough to find it. That belief had guided most of my adult life. It was also the reason I completely missed the signs that my own career was about to be dismantled by people sitting only a few offices away. Looking back now, I realize it didn't begin with one dramatic moment. It began with silence. The kind of silence that slowly replaces friendly conversations. The kind that makes you wonder whether everyone else knows something you don't. At the time, though, I convinced myself I was imagining it. I had more important things to worry about. Every Thursday evening after work, I drove across town to visit my mother. She had been diagnosed with Parkinson's 3 years earlier. She was still fiercely independent, but every month became a little harder than the one before. I handled her medical bills, grocery shopping, and every piece of paperwork she refused to admit she needed help with. She hated feeling like a burden. I hated that she thought she was one. "You're working too much," she told me almost every visit. "You've been saying that since I was 25, I answered with a smile. And I was right then, too. She always laughed after saying it. That laugh made the long days worth it. My son Noah was 20 years old and halfway through engineering school. He worked part-time on weekends, but tuition wasn't cheap. Neither were textbooks, or rent, or life. Sometimes I'd look at my bank account late at night and mentally calculate how many months we could survive if something unexpected happened. Not because I enjoyed worrying, because planning made me feel safe. The paycheck I earned wasn't just my income, it held together 3 different lives. Mine, my mother's, and my son's future. Losing that job wasn't an inconvenience. It was the kind of possibility that quietly wakes you up at 3 in the morning. The strange thing is, I wasn't worried about losing it. Not then. After 16 years with the company, I'd earned excellent performance reviews, trained half the accounting department, and stayed through 2 recessions, 1 merger, and a cyber attack that had nearly shut us down for a week. I believed loyalty still meant something. Maybe that was my biggest mistake. The first indication that things were changing arrived in the form of an email. Nothing dramatic, just a company-wide announcement. Effective immediately, Daniel Mercer has been appointed Chief Operations Officer. I had never met Daniel. His resume was impressive: MBA, consulting background, corporate restructuring specialist. The words sounded positive: progress, efficiency, transformation. Everyone congratulated the executive team. Everyone except Linda. Linda had worked in human resources longer than I'd been in finance. She read the email, looked toward my office, then quietly sighed. "What?" I asked. She forced a smile. "Oh." "Nothing." It didn't feel like nothing. A week later, Daniel held his first executive meeting. He walked into the conference room wearing the kind of confidence that arrived before introductions. Tall, perfectly tailored navy suit, polished shoes that reflected the lights overhead. He smiled often, but somehow his eyes never changed expression. "I appreciate everything this company has accomplished," he began, "but surviving isn't the same as growing." Heads nodded around the room. "We're going to modernize every department." Another pause. "We'll reward adaptability." That sentence stayed with me. At the time, I couldn't explain why. The meeting continued with charts, projections, and strategic goals. Everything sounded reasonable. Until Daniel stopped beside my chair, he glanced at the financial reports I'd prepared. "You've been here 16 years? Yes. That's impressive." He smiled again, then added almost casually, "Sometimes experience becomes comfort." Before I could respond, he'd already moved on. The comment lasted maybe 3 seconds. It stayed in my head for days. When the meeting ended, my coworker Sarah caught up with me near the elevators. "What did he mean by that?" "I honestly don't know." "You think he's planning layoffs?" I laughed. Finance always assumes layoffs. She laughed too, but neither of us sounded convinced. Over the next 2 weeks, little things started changing. Department heads who normally included me in planning meetings suddenly forgot to send invitations. Projects I'd managed for years were reassigned without explanation. Questions that once came directly to me now went through newer employees. None of it seemed serious enough to complain about. Individually, each incident could have been an oversight. Together, they formed a pattern. One afternoon, I walked into the break room and stopped. Conversation ended immediately. 3 coworkers suddenly became very interested in their coffee cups. Someone muttered something about deadlines. Within seconds, everyone had found a reason to leave. I stood there alone beside the coffee machine, listening to silence. It's remarkable how quickly silence can make you question yourself. Had I offended someone, missed an email, handled something poorly? The human mind would rather blame itself than accept that someone else may already be working against it. That Friday evening, Daniel stopped by my office just as I was packing my laptop. "Working late again? A few reports to finish." He nodded. "Dedicated employees are valuable." There was another pause. "But companies have to evolve." I smiled politely. "I'm always open to learning new systems." "I'm sure you are." His smile never reached his eyes. He walked away. I watched him disappear down the hallway without understanding why a simple conversation had left me so uneasy. The following Monday started like every other Monday. Coffee, emails, budget reconciliation, vendor invoices. Normal, comfortably normal. At exactly 10:17 that morning, a notification appeared on my computer. Human Resources requests your presence at 2 p.m. No explanation. No subject line, just the meeting invitation. I stared at the screen longer than I probably should have. 16 years. Not once had Human Resources asked to meet with me unexpectedly. I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. Benefits, policy updates, compliance paperwork, something routine. Still, for reasons I couldn't explain, my hands suddenly felt cold. I looked through the glass wall of my office. Across the floor, I noticed Linda from HR standing near the copier. She glanced toward me for just a second, then quickly looked away. That was the exact moment a quiet thought entered my mind for the first time. What if this isn't routine? I had no idea that by the end of that afternoon, the security I'd spent 16 years building would begin to disappear beneath my feet. At 1:55 p.m., I found myself standing outside the Human Resources office, smoothing the wrinkles from my navy blazer for no reason other than needing something to do with my hands. I had spent the entire morning trying to convince myself I was overreacting. People got called into HR all the time. Policy updates, benefits, training requirements. Maybe someone needed financial documentation for an internal audit. There were dozens of harmless explanations. At least, that's what I kept repeating to myself. Linda opened the door before I had a chance to knock. "Emily?" Her smile was warm, but something about it felt careful. "Come in." The conference room was smaller than I expected. A round table, 3 chairs, a window overlooking the employee parking lot. Daniel Mercer was already sitting inside. That surprised me. Why was the new chief operations officer attending an HR meeting with the finance manager? He stood as I entered. "Emily. Daniel." Linda quietly closed the door behind us. That simple click echoed louder than it should have. Daniel folded his hands on the table. "First, let me say this isn't a disciplinary meeting." The words should have relaxed me. Instead, they made my stomach tighten. People rarely begin conversations that way unless they're about to say something you won't like. "We're reviewing organizational structure across every department," he continued. "We've identified opportunities to improve efficiency." I nodded. "So," he slid a folder toward me, "we'd like to evaluate everyone's responsibilities." I opened it. Inside was a list of my daily duties. Except several of them weren't mine. I frowned. "I don't manage inventory reconciliation." Daniel leaned back. "Our records suggest you do." "They're incorrect." He tapped another page. "And payroll forecasting? I supervise budget planning, not forecasting." For the first time, I noticed Linda watching the conversation without saying a word, almost like she wanted to interrupt, but couldn't. Daniel smiled politely. "I'm sure we'll sort out any misunderstandings." Misunderstandings. Such an innocent word. yet something about the way he said it made it sound like the responsibility already belonged to me. The meeting lasted barely 20 minutes. No accusations, no warnings, no threats. When it ended, Daniel stood. "Thank you for your time." I gathered the papers. "I'll email corrections this afternoon. I'm looking forward to reviewing them." His tone remained perfectly professional, but as I walked back toward finance, one thought refused to leave me. Why would executive leadership create an evaluation based on responsibilities I had never performed? That evening, I stayed almost 2 hours after everyone else had gone home. I compared my official job description with every annual performance review I'd received over the past decade. Every single one matched. None mentioned inventory reconciliation, none mentioned payroll forecasting. Someone had created entirely new expectations and attached my name to them. It didn't make sense. Unless the purpose wasn't accuracy, the purpose was documentation. I closed my laptop and immediately hated the direction my thoughts were heading. No, I was jumping to conclusions. Daniel had only been with the company a few weeks. Maybe someone in HR had copied the wrong template. Mistakes happened. I wanted to believe that. I really did. The next morning, Sarah stopped beside my desk carrying 2 coffees. "I figured you needed this." "I always need coffee." She smiled. "How'd the HR meeting go?" I hesitated. "Strange." "What kind of strange?" I lowered my voice. "They had responsibilities listed that aren't even part of my position." Her smile disappeared. "They did what?" I corrected everything. Sarah glanced around before pulling a chair closer. "They called Kevin in yesterday. Our IT manager." She nodded. "And Melissa from purchasing." "What for?" "They won't say." A chill ran through me. Did either of them mention job reviews? Sarah slowly shook her head. No. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, she whispered, "Something's happening." I wanted to disagree. Instead, I looked across the office toward Daniel's glass-walled executive suite. He was standing inside talking to someone I didn't recognize. Both of them looked toward the accounting department, toward us, toward me. Then the blinds slowly closed. The days that followed felt different. Not dramatically, just enough to keep me constantly off balance. Requests arrived with impossible deadlines. Reports I had submitted weeks earlier suddenly couldn't be found. One afternoon, Daniel emailed asking why a quarterly variance report hadn't been completed. I attached the original email showing I had submitted it 12 days earlier. His reply came only minutes later. "Thank you. We'll investigate why it wasn't properly filed." No apology, no explanation, just another incident quietly disappearing into the system. By Friday, I had started saving copies of everything. Every report, every email, every approval, every spreadsheet. 16 years in finance had taught me one lesson above all else. Paper trails protect people. At the time, I believed I was simply being cautious. Looking back now, those folders on my laptop would become the only reason I still had a career a few weeks later. I just didn't know it yet, because early Monday morning, before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee, another email appeared. This one wasn't from Human Resources. It came directly from Daniel Mercer, Mandatory Performance Review. Tuesday, 9:00 a.m. Attendance required. No additional details. I stared at the screen until the coffee beside my keyboard went cold, for the first time in 16 years. I honestly wondered if I was about to lose my job. I barely slept the night before my performance review. Not because I believed I'd done anything wrong, because uncertainty has a way of exhausting you more than bad news ever could. Bad news gives you something to respond to. Uncertainty just keeps asking questions your mind can't answer. By 6:30 Tuesday morning, I was already sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside my laptop. For the third time, I reviewed every major report I'd completed during the previous 6 months. Every balance sheet, every budget summary, every quarterly forecast. I wasn't looking for mistakes anymore. I was looking for reassurance. The numbers were exactly where they should have been. Everything reconciled. Everything matched. Yet the knot in my stomach refused to loosen. Before leaving for work, I called my mother. She answered on the second ring. "You're up early." "I have a meeting." "The important kind?" I smiled even though she couldn't see me. "I think so." She was quiet for a moment. You've sounded tired lately. I'm fine. No, she said gently. You're pretending to be fine. Mothers have an incredible talent for hearing the truth hidden between ordinary words. I'll be okay, I said. I know you will. There was absolute certainty in her voice. You've never needed luck, Emily. You've always had integrity. After we hung up, I sat in my car for another minute before starting the engine. I didn't realize then how much I'd need to remember those words over the coming weeks. The office felt unusually quiet that morning. People greeted me politely, but conversations seemed to stop whenever I walked past. Maybe I was imagining it. Or maybe once fear enters your life, you begin noticing things that were always there. At exactly 8:55, I walked toward conference room B. Daniel was already inside. Linda sat beside him with a legal pad resting on her lap. There was another man I hadn't met before. Gray suit, wire-rimmed glasses. No smile. Daniel stood. Emily, thank you for coming. I nodded to everyone before taking my seat. This is Robert Ellis, Daniel said, our internal compliance manager. Robert simply nodded. No handshake, no introduction beyond his title. Daniel folded his hands. We've been reviewing departmental performance, so I understand. We've also been reviewing financial accuracy. I felt myself straighten in my chair. Okay. He slid a printed report across the table. Could you explain this transaction? I looked down. Vendor payment, $48,000. Approved 3 weeks earlier. Except, I'd never seen it before. I frowned. I didn't authorize this. Daniel remained calm. Our records indicate it was approved using your credentials. I looked again. There was my employee ID, my digital approval, my authorization code. For just a second. My own eyes betrayed me. Had I forgotten? No, impossible. I approved hundreds of transactions every month, but I remembered large payments, especially one this size. I didn't process this. Robert finally spoke. Are you suggesting the system is incorrect? I'm saying I never approved this payment. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Our cybersecurity team confirms the approval originated from your account. My account doesn't mean me. The room became very quiet. Linda looked down at her notebook. She still hadn't spoken. Daniel tapped another document. This vendor doesn't exist. I stared at him. What? The company receiving the payment appears to be fictitious. A wave of cold spread through my chest. Someone had created a fake vendor, and somehow my credentials were attached to it. Robert watched my expression carefully. You understand why this concerns us? Of course I do. Daniel asked the next question so calmly it almost sounded casual. Has anyone else ever had access to your login credentials? No. Have you ever shared your password? Never. Robert wrote something on his notepad. Every scratch of his pen suddenly sounded louder than the conversation itself. Daniel closed the folder. We're not reaching conclusions today, but this matter requires investigation. I agree. His eyebrows lifted slightly. You do? More than anyone. That answer seemed to surprise him, because it was the truth. If someone had used my identity inside the accounting system, I wanted to know who, just as badly as they supposedly did. The meeting ended without disciplinary action, but as I stepped into the hallway, I noticed something that made my heart sink. 2 employees standing near the elevators immediately stopped talking when they saw me. One of them looked away. The other offered an awkward smile. News traveled fast inside every company, especially bad news. By lunchtime, I could almost feel the rumors moving through the building. Nobody accused me directly. Nobody had to. People became unusually polite, which was somehow worse. Back in my office, I closed the door for the first time in years. Then I reopened the transaction Daniel had shown me. Something caught my attention immediately. The timestamp. 9:42 p.m. 3 weeks earlier. I frowned. At 9:42 that night. I hadn't been at work. I had been sitting in the neurology department at St. Mary's Hospital with my mother during one of her follow-up appointments. I knew because I still had the parking receipt tucked inside my wallet. My breathing slowed, then quickened again. If I could prove where I had been. Then I could prove I hadn't approved that payment. I opened my calendar. Hospital appointment. 7:30 p.m. exactly the same evening. Next, I checked my phone's location history. The blue timeline placed me at St. Mary's from 7:18 until almost 10:30, not downtown, not even close to the office. I leaned back in my chair. Someone hadn't just made a mistake. Someone had used my identity while I was miles away. For the first time, I stopped asking whether I was being targeted. I started asking who would benefit if I disappeared. And one name quietly rose above all the others. Daniel Mercer. I wasn't ready to accuse him, not yet. But one thing had become painfully clear. This was no longer about a performance review. Someone inside Ashcroft Manufacturing was building a case against me, one document at a time, and unless I uncovered the truth first, the next meeting wouldn't be about an investigation. It would be about my termination. The first thing I did after leaving the office that evening wasn't drive home. It was drive back to St. Mary's Hospital. The parking garage looked exactly the same as it had 3 weeks earlier. Gray concrete, bright fluorescent lights, the faint smell of disinfectant drifting through the entrance every time the automatic doors opened. I stood for a moment, staring at the ticket machine. 3 weeks ago, this had simply been another appointment with my mother. Now, it felt like part of a criminal investigation. Inside the hospital, I approached the information desk. A young receptionist smiled politely. "Can I help you? I need proof that I was here on the evening of March 17th. She looked apologetic. "We can't release medical records without authorization." "I don't need medical records." I took a slow breath. "I just need confirmation that I checked in with my mother that night. She disappeared into a back office for several minutes before returning with a supervisor. After explaining the situation, they agreed to provide a simple attendance verification. Nothing confidential, just the date, the time, and confirmation that I had accompanied my mother during her appointment." As the supervisor handed me the printed letter, she smiled kindly. "I hope everything works out." "So do I." Walking back to my car, I finally felt something I hadn't experienced in days. Relief. Not because the problem was solved, because I now had proof. Proof that at 9:42 p.m., the exact moment someone claimed I had approved a fraudulent payment, I had been sitting inside a hospital nearly 20 miles away. Whoever was doing this hadn't expected me to verify the timeline. They'd assumed I would simply defend myself. Instead, I was starting to collect evidence. The next morning, I arrived at work nearly an hour early. The accounting department was still empty. I liked the silence. It gave me room to think. I unlocked my office, turned on my computer, and began reviewing system access logs. Most employees didn't even know these records existed. Every login, every password reset, every remote connection, every failed attempt. The information was there, if someone knew where to look. I searched my employee ID. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Normal office logins, normal work hours. Then, one entry made me stop. A remote login. 11:18 p.m. The same night as the fake vendor payment. I frowned. That wasn't possible. I had already been asleep by then. The login had originated from outside the company network. My heartbeat quickened. Someone had accessed my account remotely. I printed the log before anyone else arrived. Then I printed another copy, and another. One stayed in my desk. One went into my purse. One I planned to leave with my attorney if things became worse. 16 years in finance had taught me that evidence has an unfortunate habit of disappearing once people realize it's dangerous. By 9 o'clock, the office was buzzing again. Sarah stopped outside my door. "You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't." She stepped inside and quietly closed the door. I heard something. I looked up immediately. "What?" She lowered her voice. "Daniel's interviewing candidates." "For which position?" She hesitated, then looked directly at me. "Yours." For a second, I genuinely thought I'd misunderstood. "My position?" She nodded. "I only know because Melissa accidentally copied me on a scheduling email." I felt the room become strangely still. "They're already replacing me." "I don't know if that's official." "But the job description," she swallowed. "It matches yours almost word for word." I looked past her toward the window. The city outside continued moving exactly as it always had. Traffic, people, construction cranes, none of it had changed. Yet inside my office, everything suddenly had. If they were interviewing replacements, then the investigation wasn't really an investigation. It was paperwork. Paperwork meant to justify a decision that had already been made. Around noon, my phone vibrated. It was Noah. "Hey, Mom." His voice was cheerful. "You working?" "Always. I just wanted to tell you." He laughed. "I got an A on my engineering project." I closed my eyes. "I'm so proud of you. I knew you'd want to hear before I forgot." For a few minutes, we talked about ordinary things. Classes, his roommates, a professor who graded impossibly hard exams. When we hung up, I realized something. I hadn't told him anything. Not about HR, not about Daniel, not about the investigation. I couldn't, because if I said the words out loud, they might become real. Late that afternoon, an email appeared. Mandatory department meeting. Attendance required. 5 o'clock, conference room A. Every manager was present. Daniel stood at the front of the room beside a projection screen. "I'd like to discuss accountability." The word immediately caught my attention. He clicked to the first slide. Company losses, budget variances, compliance failures. Nothing specific, just enough information to create concern. Then he looked around the room. "As many of you know," he paused deliberately, "we're investigating a serious financial irregularity." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. "We expect complete cooperation from everyone involved." His eyes found mine, only for a second. But it was enough. I understood exactly what he was doing. He hadn't mentioned my name. He didn't need to. The implication was already hanging over the room. As employees filed out after the meeting, conversations started immediately. Whispers, quick glances, abrupt silence whenever I walked by. Rumors spread faster than official announcements. And they rarely waited for facts. That evening, I remained alone in my office long after sunset. The cleaning crew had already begun vacuuming the hallways. I opened the system logs one more time. Something about them bothered me. I looked closer. Then, closer still. Finally, I saw it. The remote login had come from an administrator connection. My account. Someone else's authorization. That combination should have been impossible. Unless someone with administrative privileges had entered the system pretending to be me. I leaned back slowly. This wasn't random. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't even an isolated incident. Whoever was framing me knew exactly how the company's financial software worked. They also knew enough to make the evidence appear convincing. But they had made one mistake. A small one. The kind most people would never notice. The administrator authentication left a digital fingerprint. Tiny. Almost invisible. But it was there. And for the first time since all of this had started. I wasn't thinking about how to defend myself. I was thinking about how to catch the person who believed they'd built the perfect trap. The next morning, I walked into the office with one decision already made. I wasn't going to confront Daniel. Not yet. People who believe they're winning become careless. I needed him to stay confident. Confident people make mistakes. Desperate people cover their tracks. That morning, Daniel still thought I was desperate. I intended to keep it that way. I greeted everyone as I normally did. Smiled, poured myself a cup of coffee, answered emails. If anyone was watching me, I wanted them to see exactly what they expected. A woman trying to hold herself together. Not one quietly collecting evidence. Around 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed. It was an internal message from Daniel. "Please stop by my office at 10:30, no explanation. Just another invitation." I saved the message before standing up. Old habit. Every conversation was becoming part of a timeline now. Daniel's office overlooked the river. The view was spectacular. Floor-to-ceiling windows, modern furniture, minimal decoration. Everything about the room projected control. He motioned for me to sit. "I'll keep this brief," I nodded. "The investigation is continuing." I assumed it was. "We're trying to move quickly. I appreciate that." He folded his hands. In situations like these, cooperation usually produces the best outcome. There it was again. That carefully chosen language. Not truth, not facts. Outcome. "I've cooperated with every request," I said calmly. "You have." Another pause. "But sometimes employees remember details later." "I haven't forgotten anything." He smiled. "I hope that's true." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he stood. "That'll be all." As I reached the door, he spoke again. "Oh, Emily." I turned around. "If you have anything you'd like to disclose before the investigation concludes." His smile returned. This would be the time. I met his eyes. I couldn't agree more. For the first time since he'd arrived at Ashcroft Manufacturing. His smile faltered, only for a fraction of a second. But I noticed, and judging by the way he quickly looked away, so had he. Back at my desk, I replayed the conversation in my mind. He hadn't asked questions. He hadn't requested documents. He'd been fishing, waiting to see if I'd panic, waiting to see if I'd confess to something I hadn't done. That alone told me something important. He still didn't know what I knew. Good. I intended to keep it that way. Around lunchtime, Sarah appeared in my doorway again. "You busy? Come in." She quietly shut the door behind her. "I shouldn't even be telling you this." My pulse quickened. "What happened?" "I was in purchasing this morning." She lowered her voice. "Daniel asked Melissa to prepare paperwork for a management transition." "What kind of transition?" Sarah hesitated. "They're rewriting the approval hierarchy." I frowned. "What does that mean? If you leave—" She swallowed. "Your financial authority transfers directly to him." The room suddenly felt smaller, so he wouldn't even need an interim manager. She slowly shook her head. "No." I leaned back in my chair. Everything clicked into place. This wasn't just about getting rid of me. It was about gaining unrestricted control over financial approvals. Without me, no one would question unusual transactions. No one knew the accounting system as thoroughly as I did, and no one had challenged Daniel yet. Until now. That afternoon, I requested access to archived vendor files. Nothing unusual. Finance managers did it all the time. As thousands of records loaded onto my screen, I searched for the fake company attached to the fraudulent payment. Nothing. No previous invoices, no tax documents, no registration history. Almost as if the company had appeared overnight, then disappeared, I expanded the search. Instead of looking for the vendor, I searched the bank account number. 3 results appeared. I blinked. 3? The account wasn't linked to one vendor. It was linked to 3 different company names. 3 completely different businesses, all using the exact same banking information. My heartbeat accelerated. That should never happen. Legitimate vendors never share identical payment accounts. Never. Unless they weren't legitimate vendors. Someone had created multiple shell companies. I quickly exported the records onto an encrypted flash drive I kept locked in my desk. As the files copied, I glanced toward the hallway. No one was there. Still. For reasons I couldn't explain. I unplugged the drive the second the transfer finished. Something told me these records wouldn't stay in the system forever. At 5:15, the office had almost emptied. I was organizing my notes when someone knocked softly on my open door. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't Linda. It was Robert Ellis, the compliance manager. He looked different without Daniel standing beside him. Less confident, more tired. "Do you have a minute?" I gestured toward the chair. "Of course." He remained standing. "I won't stay long." He looked out into the hallway before quietly closing the door. That immediately caught my attention. "I've worked compliance for 27 years, he said. "I've seen honest employees make mistakes." I waited. "I've also seen innocent employees become convenient." Neither of us spoke for a moment. Finally, I asked, "What are you trying to tell me?" He reached into his briefcase, without saying a word. He placed a sealed envelope on my desk. I shouldn't be doing this. I stared at the envelope. "What is it?" "I can't answer that." "Why give it to me?" His expression hardened. "Because something about this investigation doesn't feel right." He took a slow breath. "And because, if I'm correct..." He looked directly into my eyes. "You're asking the wrong question." What question should I be asking? Robert walked toward the door. With his hand on the handle, he stopped. "Don't ask who approved the fake payment." He looked back one last time. "Ask who created the vendor." Before I could say another word, he opened the door and disappeared down the hallway. I looked at the sealed envelope lying on my desk. My name was written across the front in blue ink. Nothing else. No return address. No explanation. Outside my office, the lights of the accounting department were beginning to switch off one by one. Inside, I slowly reached for the envelope. Something told me that whatever was inside wasn't just another piece of evidence. It was the first crack in the story Daniel Mercer had worked so hard to build. For almost a full minute, I just stared at the envelope. The accounting floor was nearly empty now. The only sounds were the distant hum of the air conditioning and the occasional vacuum cleaner somewhere down the hall. Robert Ellis didn't seem like the kind of man who acted impulsively. For 27 years, he'd built a career around procedures, compliance, and documentation. If he had risked giving me something in secret, it had to matter. I turned the envelope over. No seal from the company, no department logo, just plain white paper. Carefully, I opened it. Inside were 3 printed pages. The first page was a vendor registration form. I immediately recognized the company name, Northridge Consulting, LLC. The same fake vendor Daniel had questioned me about during the investigation. But this version wasn't the one I'd been shown. This one contained metadata, information that normally never appeared on printed copies. Document creation date, author, revision history. I frowned. Someone had accidentally printed the internal version instead of the finalized record. My eyes moved to the bottom of the page. Document created by D. Mercer. I stopped breathing. I read it again, then a third time. There was no mistake. The initials were unmistakable. Daniel Mercer. Not finance, not purchasing, not vendor management. The chief operations officer himself had created the vendor profile. That alone violated company policy. Executives weren't allowed to create vendors. The separation of duties existed precisely to prevent fraud. I quickly turned to the second page. It was an approval workflow report. Every new vendor normally required 3 separate approvals: finance, purchasing, compliance. Except this one hadn't. Someone had manually overridden the approval chain. The override authorization belonged to an administrator account, the same type of administrator access I'd discovered in the system logs. I felt my heartbeat pounding against my ribs. The pieces were beginning to connect. Someone with administrative privileges had created the fake vendor, then used my credentials to approve the payment. The trap hadn't started with the payment. It had started weeks earlier, maybe months. The payment had simply been the final step. I reached for my phone, then stopped. No, calling anyone from my office wasn't safe anymore. If Daniel had manipulated financial systems, I couldn't assume company phones were private. Instead, I photographed every page using my personal phone. Then, I saved the images to a secure cloud folder. Only after confirming the upload did I place the originals back inside the envelope. Years of working in finance had taught me something simple. Evidence only helps you if it survives. As I slipped the envelope into my purse, another document caught my attention. A folded yellow sticky note had fallen onto my desk. I unfolded it. Only one sentence had been written. Check vendor 44721. No signature, nothing else. Vendor 44721. I had never heard that number before, but Robert clearly expected me to understand its importance. The following morning, I arrived before sunrise again. The building was still dark. Security nodded as I entered. Morning, Emily. Morning. I smiled naturally, inside. My mind was racing. I logged into the accounting system. Instead of searching by company name, I searched using the vendor identification number. The record appeared immediately. At first glance, nothing looked unusual. A maintenance supplier, 5 years with the company, clean payment history. Then I noticed something odd. Its banking information had been updated. Only 4 months earlier, I opened the change history. My eyes narrowed. The update had been approved by Daniel Mercer. That made no sense. Daniel hadn't even worked at Ashcroft Manufacturing 5 months ago. He had joined the company less than 3 months earlier. Yet somehow, the system showed him approving a banking change before he was officially hired. I whispered to myself, "That's impossible. Unless..." The record had been altered afterward. Someone hadn't just manipulated payments. They had manipulated historical data. That required administrator-level access. Exactly what I'd already suspected. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Sarah stepped inside carrying her coffee. "You beat me again?" "I couldn't sleep." She studied my face. "You found something." I hesitated. The less she knew, the safer she'd be. I'm starting to understand what's happening. Can you prove it? Not yet, she sighed. I wish I could help. You already are. She looked confused. By treating me exactly the same. She smiled sadly. I don't think everyone else is. I followed her eyes. Across the department, conversation stopped the moment I looked up. A few coworkers quickly returned to their monitors. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Rumors had become assumptions. Assumptions were becoming judgments. 16 years of trust were disappearing in less than 2 weeks. Just before lunch, Linda from Human Resources appeared outside my office. She didn't come in. She simply whispered, "Walk with me." We headed toward the employee cafeteria. Instead of entering, she continued through an empty hallway leading to an unused training room. Only after closing the door did she speak. I don't have much time. Her hands were trembling. Linda. She interrupted me. Your personnel file. What about it? I reviewed it yesterday, and there are documents inside that weren't there a month ago. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. What kind of documents? Written complaints. I stared at her. I've never received complaints. I know. Who filed them? I don't know. She shook her head. The signatures belong to managers from different departments. Were they real? I called one of them this morning. She swallowed hard. He told me he'd never seen the document. Someone had forged internal complaints, not just financial records, personnel records too. Whoever was behind this wasn't trying to create one reason to fire me. They were creating an entire history, a fictional version of Emily Carter, one who suddenly looked incompetent, careless, untrustworthy, the perfect employee to dismiss. Before leaving, Linda grabbed my arm. There was fear in her eyes, real fear. Emily. What? They're scheduling another meeting. When? Tomorrow morning. I took a slow breath. What kind of meeting? She looked down for a second before answering. The paperwork has already been prepared. My heart sank. She forced herself to meet my eyes. They're calling it a final employment review. Neither of us said another word, because we both understood what those words really meant. They believed they had everything they needed to fire me. What they didn't know was that sitting inside my purse was an envelope capable of destroying the entire case they'd spent weeks building, and tomorrow. For the first time, I wasn't walking into that conference room alone. I was walking in with the truth.